This is Ken Hamm. If you're unfamiliar, he did a debate with Bill Nye not too long ago. This is Bill Nye on stage. He's a tiny little fellow over there in the bottom left, but you can kind of see him. They did a debate on creationism. Now, this is a little bit of an older debate, but it's fascinating. So I wanted to give it a watch and see what they had to say. Ken Hamm just went through his 30-minute segment, and we're about to listen to Bill Nye give his section. So let's give this a listen and see what they have to say. And while we do, we're going to play some Breath of the Wild 1. I just got the Master Sword. I'm going to be doing the Shrine Trials, or the Master Sword Trials, or whatever you call it. All right, let's get into it.
Does Ken Hamm's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So for me, of course, take a look. We're here in Kentucky on layer upon layer upon layer of limestone. I stopped at the side of the road today and picked up just a piece of limestone that has a fossil right there. Now, in these many, many layers...
Like, imagine stopping on the side of the road and finding a fossil. I have never done that before.
In this vicinity of Kentucky, there are coral animals, fossil, zooxanthellae. And when you look at it closely, you can see that they live their entire lives. They lived typically 20 years, sometimes more than that, if the water conditions are correct. And so we are standing on millions of layers of ancient life. How could those animals have lived their entire life and formed these layers in just 4,000 years? There isn't enough time.
Obviously, but... You know the interesting thing about this. Here's how the argument goes. I already know what his answer is going to be. He has these pre-set up answers to all of this stuff, just basic kind of dialogue tree that he uses. And if you prove his dialogue tree wrong, if you prove something that he says wrong, his answer is always, well, I just start from the Bible. That's my starting point. I believe the Bible says this, even though it absolutely does not. And so, yeah, that's it. I just believe that I believe this because I believe it, and I believe it because I believe it. That's it. It's just circular logic all the way down. There is no reason for him to actually believe all of this stuff ultimately. But when backed into a corner, he'll say, I believe it on faith, and you can't argue with that. So,
since Mr. Hamm's flood, for this limestone that we're standing on to have come into existence. My scientific colleagues go to places like Greenland, the Arctic, they go to Antarctica, and they drill into the ice with hollow drill bits. It's not that extraordinary. Many of you have probably done it yourselves, drilling other things, hole saws to put locks in doors, for example. And we pull out long cylinders of ice, long ice rods. And these are made of snow. And by long tradition, it's called snow ice. And snow ice forms over the winter as snowflakes fall and are crushed down by subsequent layers. They're crushed together and trapping the little bubbles. And the little bubbles must needs be ancient atmosphere. There's nobody running around with a hypodermic needle squirting ancient atmosphere into the bubbles.
That's clever. I know exactly what Ken Hamm's retort is going to be, to this conundrum that Bill Nye just created for him, and I'll tell you in a second. It's absurd when you put the answer right next to the question. Just listen a little more here.
And we find certain of these cylinders to have 680,000 layers. 680,000 snow, winter, summer cycles. How could it be that just 4,000 years ago, all of this ice formed? Let's just run some numbers. This is some scenes from lovely Antarctic. Let's say we have 680,000 layers of snow ice and 4,000 years since the Great Flood. That would mean we'd need 170 winter, summer cycles every year for the last...
Okay, so here's the answer that Ken Hamm comes up with for this. He says it's not exactly one winter-summer cycle. It's not based on winter-summer cycles. It's based on hot-cold cycles. And it's the same with trees. So it's not exactly one tree ring per year. It varies a little bit. And he's absolutely correct about that. But it doesn't vary 170 times every single year for 6,000 or 4,000 years. It is an absolutely absurd thing for him to have said. He argues it could have varied any number of times, or it could have had as many cycles per year as it needed. You have no idea how many cycles. Maybe one year it had 5,000 cycles. At this point, as far as the logic goes, as far as Ken Hamm's logic goes, it's gone, right? There is no logic to be had here. His mind is shot. That's as bad as a flat earther being faced with their ridiculous claims and being forced to admit that they're wrong on these various things, and finally buckling down and saying, well, you know what? There's an ice barrier on the outer edge of the earth. That's what's keeping everything. That's what's keeping people from going out there any further. They just start coming up with the most ridiculous answers that make no sense at all and don't belong in this conversation anywhere. That's what Ken Hamm's answer is going to be later. Oh, another answer. So Bill Nye is, one more thing. Bill Nye is drawing this problem out with snow ice. The same problem exists with tree rings and with radiocarbon dating, or not just carbon dating, but like uranium, lead, and potassium argon. Is that potassium's pair? I don't remember. Every radioactive material has, I want to call it a daughter isotope. Is that it? It may be a daughter isotope. Anyways, it has something that it decays into, right? So uranium is radioactive. That means that it's shooting off protons. When it throws off a proton, that means it goes from one element on the periodic table to another element on the periodic table. Uranium turns from uranium to lead over the course of time. In fact, we can measure it. We know exactly how long it takes for uranium to turn to lead. For 1 gram of uranium, for example, to turn to 1 gram of lead. The half-life of U-238, which is the specific type of uranium we're talking about here, is 4.5 times 109 years. The end product of the decay of U-238 is Pb-206. After one half-life, a 1 gram sample of uranium will have decayed to 0.5 grams of U-238 and 0.43 grams of Pb-206. This is a chart of uranium decay. So if we start with 10 grams, it's on a logarithmic scale, eventually slowly and gradually slows down like this. So number of half-lives, one half-life is 5.27 years. The half-life, it appears as though the half-life of uranium-238 is 4.5 billion years. So 1/2 of 10 grams of uranium will decay in 4.5 billion years. It's a very, very long time. And that's why it's logarithmic. It slows down the less you have in a group, basically. Now, the reason that it slows down and changes its pace is because there are more protons firing off and knocking... Oh my god. Breath of the Wild crashed. I've never seen that before. There are more protons firing off and knocking other protons off when there's more in a group. And those protons are not firing off and wreaking havoc as much when there's less in the group. That's why it's on a logarithmic scale, from my understanding. So anyways, it takes 4.5 billion years for 1/2 of an amount of uranium to decay, is my understanding. We have cases of uranium, a certain amount of uranium, say 15 grams of uranium, and 3 grams of lead sitting next to each other. You can clearly see that the uranium decayed into the lead over the course of a certain amount of time. And we don't just have one example of that. We have 1 billion examples of it. You know how many uranium mines there are? Uranium is just like a rock, basically. You go in and you mine it like coal. Anyways, the point is, uranium decays at a specific rate, and we have 1 billion examples of uranium sitting next to a certain amount of lead, which unequivocally proves that the Earth is older than 6,000 years because there's an amount larger than there should be. Ken Hamm's answer to that? You don't know how much lead was there originally. Seriously. This is just, at this point, there's no logic to be had. Ken Hamm is not using logic anywhere in his talk. Just be aware of that as we go through this.
Last 4,000 years. I mean, wouldn't someone have noticed that? Wow. Wouldn't someone have noticed that there's been winter, summer 170 times one year? If we go to California, we find enormous stands of bristlecone pines. Some of them are over 6,000 years old, 6,800 years old. There's a
like 4,000 to 6,000 years is only plausibly our written history at best. And our written history is, how old is our written history? 5,000 years, roughly. So we have records of writings from 5,000 years ago. Beyond 5,000 years, we have to look for evidence of, like, stone tools and things like that, right? But Ken Hamm absolutely insists that no, our history began when we started writing things down. That's it. It's just ridiculous on so many levels.
Famous tree in Sweden, Old Tycho, is 9,550 years old. How could these trees be there if there was an enormous flood just 4,000 years ago? You can try this yourself, everybody. I don't mean to be mean to trees, but...
He does. Don't let him fool you. I know people who know Bill Nye. I know people who hang out with him, who've talked to him and stuff, and they've told me he does mean to be mean to trees. That's like his whole goal in life, they told me.
Get a sapling and put it underwater for a year. It will not survive.
See, what kind of depraved mind would come up with something like that, right? Only somebody who hates trees. That's it.
In general, nor will its seeds. They just won't make it. So how could these trees be that old if the Earth is only 4,000 years old? Now, when we go to the Grand Canyon, which is an astonishing place, and I recommend to everybody in the world to someday visit the Grand Canyon, you find layer upon layer of ancient rocks. And if there was this enormous flood that you speak of, wouldn't there have been churning and bubbling and roiling? How would these things have settled out? Your claim that they settled out in an extraordinary short amount of time is, for me, not satisfactory. You can look.
It's not just unsatisfactory, it's absurd. It is tantamount to the flat earth conspiracy, really. They are basically no different. It's like, what is the earth sitting on? It's sitting on a turtle's back. It's turtles all the way down. It's just as absurd as what Ken Hamm here believes.
Look at these rocks. You can look at rocks that are younger. You can go to seashores where there's sand. This is what geologists on the outside do. Study the rate at which soil is deposited at the end of rivers and deltas. And we can see that it takes a long, long time for sediments to turn to stone. Also, in this picture, you can see where one type of sediment has intruded on another type. Now, if that was uniform, wouldn't we expect it all to be even without intrusion? Furthermore, you can find places in the Grand Canyon where you see an ancient riverbed on that side going to an ancient riverbed on that side, and the Colorado River has cut through it. And by the way, if this great flood drained through the Grand Canyon, wouldn't there have been a Grand Canyon on every continent?
There would be way more evidence for the claim than what we see. Ken Hamm's claim that, the Earth is 4,000 years old is seriously just as ridiculous as the flat Earth conspiracy. Just as insane.
How could we not have Grand Canyons everywhere if this water drained away in this extraordinary short amount of time, 4,000 years? Now, when you look at these layers carefully, you find these beautiful fossils. And when I say beautiful, I am inspired by them. They're remarkable because we are looking at the past. You find down low, you'll find what you might consider as rudimentary sea animals. Up above, you'll find the famous trilobites. Above that, you might find some clams, some oysters. And above that, you'll find some mammals. You never, ever find a higher animal mixed in with a lower one. You never find a lower one trying to swim its way to the higher one. If it all happened in such an extraordinary short amount of time, if this water drained away just like that, wouldn't we expect to see some turbulence? And by the way, anyone here, really?
I really appreciate that Bill Nye is breaking down every one of these claims line by line. This is so extremely valuable. Because there are so many people out there that buy this nonsense, really. You want to be a Christian and you want to, believe that God answers your prayers and helps you find your car keys, whatever. But I draw the line at the claim that the earth is 4,000 years old and that evangelical extremists are pissed off at the fact that this is being taught in schools. It's being taught in schools because it's fact. It's insane to me.
If you can find one example of that anywhere in the world, the scientists of the world challenge you. They would embrace you. You would be a hero. You would change the world if you could find one example of that anywhere. People have looked and looked and looked. They have not found a single one. Now, here's an interesting thing. These are fossil skulls that people have found all around the world. It's by no means representative of all the fossil skulls that have been found, but these are all over the place. Now, if you were to look at these, I can assure you not any of them is a gorilla.
These are all, I guess, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and not to forget my favorite Homo, which is Homo heidelbergensis, just got a wild name. I'm just a really big fan of that Homo. Anyway, I guess it's just like human history throughout the various generations or the various types of human or the types of, the evolutions of human, I guess. The evolutions leading up to human.
Right? If, as Mr. Hamm and his associates claim, there was just man and then everybody else, there were just humans and all other species, where would you put modern humans among these skulls?
About 1 to 200,000 years ago, roughly.
How did all these skulls get all over the earth in these extraordinary fashion? Where would you put us? Well, I can tell you we are on there, and I encourage you, when you go home, to look it up. Now, one of the extraordinary claims associated with Mr. Hamm's worldview is that this giant boat, very large wooden ship.
He keeps saying extraordinary claim. What he really means is absolutely insane. Like, unrealistically ridiculous. That's what he really means to say.
Went aground safely on a mountain in the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. And so places like Australia are populated then by animals who somehow managed to get from the Middle East all the way to Australia in the last 4,000 years. Now, that to me is an extraordinary claim. We would expect then, somewhere between the Middle East and Australia, we would expect to find evidence of kangaroos.
Dude, Bill Nye over here just laying down the W's. Seriously, it's just thing after thing that this dude is knocking out of the park. Years ago, there was, like, my kid's sex ed teacher started spreading bullshit Jesus stuff about how Jesus is the best and you need to follow Jesus and blah, 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 all that other garbage, right? Well, we reported her because that's against the law. And she even said, I try to slip this in sometimes so I don't get in too much trouble. She knew what she was doing. We reported the teacher. Everything exploded. Everybody found out that she was not a big fan of Jesus, not his biggest believer or whatever. Her grandparent, or one of her, well, step-grandparent, I suppose. It was her grandma's husband, new husband, I suppose. He's a piece of shit. Carl is his name. Anyway, Carl, complete piece of shit. He sat my kid down after finding out that she wasn't like a Jesus freak and tried to convince her that they discovered Noah's Ark on Mount Arafat or something, when in reality, it's just like a rock formation. They didn't discover jack shit. But these people, I mean, young Earth creationists, they will come up with the most... I'm sorry, Mount Ararat. Ararat, not Arafat, my mistake. Don't mean to shame the mountain. Anyways, they will believe anything. They being young Earth creationists. Young Earth creationists will believe anything. It's insane. That comes up in here, trust me. That's a topic of discussion in a minute.
We would expect to find some fossils, some bones. In the last 4,000 years, somebody would have been hopping along there and died along the way, and we'd find them. And furthermore, there's a claim that there was a land bridge that allowed these animals to get from Asia all the way to the continent of Australia, and that land bridge has disappeared in the last 4,000 years. No navigator, no diver, no U.S. Navy submarine, no one's ever detected any evidence of this, let alone any fossils of kangaroos.
See, this is the thing. This is what it's really all about with these, with young Earth creationists. They're convinced that there's an explanation and they come up with plausible possibilities, but none of those plausible explanations are cohesive with each other. Like, none of them work with each other. They can't all be correct, but they believe them all simultaneously. This is one of the big problems with Kent Hovind. And honestly, it's the problem with Flat Earth. Once again, I don't know, there's no better thing to compare this whole belief system to, honestly. This is as absurd as Flat Earth belief. The idea that there was a land bridge that no longer exists, and there's no evidence of it ever existing, and those animals are just there, or they evolved in a short amount of time really, really rapidly, or whatever. It's all absurd, all of it. It's like, when really pushed, usually, and, Ken Ham will admit this later in this thing. He will admit that he believes that evolution is necessary. It's a necessary explanation for life's existence. However, he doesn't think that it's possible for evolution to have taken that long, basically. Evolution, in his mind, started 4,000 years ago, and we've ended up with our current repertoire of animals and birds and blah, 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 whatever over the course of 4,000 years. He's completely ignoring the fact that we would see hundreds of new animals per day if that were true. It's an absolutely ridiculous claim. Everything that he says is ridiculous and mutually exclusive. None of this stuff works together.
So your expectation is not met. It doesn't seem to hold up. So let's see, if there are 4,000 years since Ken Ham's flood, and let's say, as he said many times, there are 7,000 kinds, today, the very, very lowest estimate is that there are about 8.7 million species. But a much more reasonable estimate is it's 50 million or even 100 million when you start counting the viruses and the bacteria and all the beetles that must be extant in the tropical rainforest that we haven't found. So
extant means living. Extinct, it's the opposite of extinct, I came to find.
So we'll take a number which I think is pretty reasonable, 16 million species today, okay? If these came from 7,000 kinds, let's say we have 7,000 subtracted from 15 million, that's 15,993. We have 4,000 years. We have 365 and a quarter days a year. We would expect to find 11 new species every day.
So here's, once again, where Ken Ham comes up with this absurd explanation that isn't cohesive with anything else, okay? Ken Ham says, in response to this, let's assume that it started 4,000 years ago, that there are only 7,000 kinds, as he lays out here, but there are only really like 10 million species today, if you think about a different definition of species or something like that. That's kind of how he lays out his absolutely ridiculous belief system. He fudges the numbers just a little bit to make it a little more realistic, completely ignoring the fact that nothing about it is realistic or logical or believable. Nothing. All of it is simply absurd.
So you'd go out into your yard, you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird, you'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species of bird every day, a new species of fish, a new species of organisms you can't see, and so on. I mean, this would be enormous news. The last 4,000 years, people would have seen these changes among us. So the Cincinnati Enquirer, I imagine, would carry a column right next to the weather report. Today's new species, and it would list these 11 every day. But we see no evidence of that. There's no evidence of these species. There just simply isn't enough time. Now, as you may know, I was graduated from engineering school, and I got a job at Boeing. I worked on 747s. Okay, everybody relax. I was very well supervised.
Scott always got these stupid jokes to tell.
Everything's fine. There's a tube in the 747 I kind of think of as my tube. But that aside, I traveled.
I guess that's what makes him, charming to some degree, right? The stupid jokes, the stupid dad jokes.
The highways of Washington State quite a bit. I was a young guy. I had a motorcycle. I used to go mountain climbing in Washington State, Oregon. And you can drive along and find these enormous boulders on top of the ground. Enormous rocks, huge, sitting on top of the ground. Now, out there in regular academic pursuits, regular geology, people...
He means logical geology, logical academic, what did he call it? Logical academic pursuits, yeah.
I've discovered that there used to be a lake in what is now Montana, which we charmingly refer to as Lake Missoula. It's not there now, but the evidence for it, of course, is, if I may, overwhelming. And so an ice dam would form at Lake Missoula, and once in a while it would break. It would build up and break, and there were multiple floods in my old state of Washington State. But just before we go on, let me just say, go Seahawks. That was very gratifying.
Okay, I don't watch football or baseball, or I don't even know what he's referring to.
Very gratifying for me. Anyway, you drive along the road, and there are these rocks. So if, as is asserted here at this facility, that the heavier rocks would sink to the bottom during a flood event, the big rocks, and especially their shape, instead of aerodynamic, the hydrodynamic, the water-changing shape, as water flows past. You'd expect them to sink to the bottom. But here are these enormous rocks right on the surface, and there's no shortage of them. If you go driving in Washington State or Oregon, they're readily available.
That's one of the things I find super fascinating. There are actually a ton of areas on the Earth that used to be oceans, or that used to be gigantic lakes. There's something really mysterious about the bottom of the ocean, But we can see the bottom of the ocean. All we have to do is go to one of these deserts that dried up and look at what's there. And you can see all kinds of bones and crazy stuff in the bottom of the ocean, or, in this desert, this now desert. It's really, really fascinating. Actually, interestingly enough, check this out. The ocean used to connect the U.S., so it ran straight through the center, and Nebraska was ocean at one point. Scientists found these big deposits of chalk, like that you'd use on a chalkboard, under some dirt in Nebraska and all the way through the the Midwest. They found these chalk deposits. Well, it turns out these chalk deposits were an animal that had a shell that died, and it would float to the bottom of the ocean, and it would kind of solidify there and join the other shells of the other animals that had fallen. And, kind of gather together and become one big, gigantic piece of chalk. That's how we get chalk and where it comes from. It was a bunch of shells from sea creatures that died, and the ocean turned into, like, normal land, and now we can dig it up. It's really interesting, actually.
So how could those be there if the Earth is just 4,000 years old? How could they be there if this one flood caused that?
How could those giant boulders be on top of these things? It doesn't make any sense. That's really interesting, right? I mean, there are so many things that don't make any sense about the creationist worldview. But it's irrelevant to these people. It doesn't matter. They don't care. You know what they care about? Trying to find some kind of consistent, plausible explanation. That's it. Doesn't have to be cohesive with any other explanation they have for anything else. All it has to do is create a little bit of doubt in people. That's it.
Another remarkable thing I'd like everybody to consider, inherent in this worldview, is that somehow Noah and his family were able to build a wooden ship that would house 14,000 individuals. There are 7,000 kinds, and there's a boy and a girl for each one of those. So it's about 14,008 people. And these people were unskilled. As far as anybody knows, they had never built a wooden ship before.
And you know what Ken Ham's response is to that? These people are unskilled. There's never been a ship like this to ever exist. You know his response? You don't know how skilled they were. God might have put the knowledge in their head. I mean, I suppose, but at this point, we are in the kind of territory where this dude is about to argue God could have created us last Thursday for all you know. With all of our active current memories that we have right now, you have no way of knowing if that happened that way or not. It's like, at a certain point, we have to just assume the most logical explanation. And that logical explanation is not God created us last Thursday. It's that there was probably a lake there that, brought those boulders to the surface or brought those boulders up higher than they should be. There were probably 600,000 winter-summer cycles that caused that snow ice to exist. That's the most logical, likely explanation. And you just have to accept it at a certain point.
Furthermore, they had to get all these animals on there, and they had to feed them, and I understand that Mr. Hamm has some explanations for that, which I frankly find extraordinary, but...
Yeah, he does.
This is the premise of the bit. And we can then run a test, a scientific test. People in the early 1900s built an extraordinarily large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. It had a motor on it for winching cables and stuff. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way.
Because wood is not as solid or as God, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the words just are not coming to me today. Because wood is not as sturdy as steel or as solid as steel. Steel also warps and twists, but not anywhere near to that degree.
And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, loss of all 14 hands.
That's a shame, but they're kind of stupid for building a wooden ship that big, right? And it's kind of ridiculous to believe that Noah did the same.
So there were 14 crewmen, aboard a ship built by very, very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding. And they couldn't build a boat as big as the Ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable?
And they had so many more advanced tools at their disposal than Noah did. Do you know that at the time that the Noah story took place, there weren't even nails? Nails didn't exist? Supposedly built it with wooden pegs? Are you kidding me? It's already a very, very tenuous situation to build a wooden boat that big when you have nails. If you don't even have nails, forget it. It's not happening. It's absurd to think such a thing could be possible. Absurd. It is not possible. Simply not possible.
Is that possible? That the best shipbuilders in the world couldn't do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do. If you visit the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., it's 163 acres.
Somebody says you can build more sturdy stuff without nails. Really? I mean, I suppose with modern techniques, we're talking about Noah and his kids. Do you think Noah and his kids could have built something more sturdy without nails? Do you think that the Ark was more sturdy without nails than with them? I'm sorry, I'm just very skeptical. I need a little bit of evidence on that one.
And they have 400 species. By the way, this picture that you're seeing was taken by spacecraft in space, orbiting the Earth. If you told...
I love it that Ken Ham actually seems to go out of his way to express that he believes that the Earth is round. He had to clear the air and make sure everybody was aware. Oh, yeah, I accept the Earth is round because it's just as absurd a conspiracy theory. Because it's not out of the realm of reasonability to think that he believes the Earth is flat also. I'm sorry, if you missed the first part, he said that in the first one. He made a point to make it clear that he believes the Earth is round.
Let alone my father, that we had that capability, they would have been amazed. That capability comes from our fundamental understanding of gravity, of material science, of physics, and life science, where you go looking. This place is often, as any zoo, is often deeply concerned and criticized for how it treats its animals. They have 400 species on 163 acres, 66 hectares. Is it reasonable that Noah and his colleagues, his family, were able to maintain 14,000 animals and themselves and feed them?
Absolutely absurd.
Aboard a ship that was bigger than anyone's ever been able to build. Now here's the thing. What we want in science as practiced out on the outside, is
by normal people.
An ability to predict. We want to have a natural law that is so obvious and clear, so well understood, that we can make predictions about what will happen. We can predict that we can put a spacecraft in orbit and take a picture of Washington, D.C. We can predict that if we provide this much room for an elephant, it will live healthily for a certain amount of time. So I'll give you an example. In the explanation provided by traditional science of how we came to be, we find, as Mr. Hamm alluded to many times in his recent remarks, we find a sequence of animals in what generally is called the fossil record. This would be to say, when we look at the layers that you would find in Kentucky, you look at them carefully, you find a sequence of animals, a succession. And as one might expect, when you're looking at old records, there's some pieces seem to be missing, a gap. So scientists got to thinking about this. There are lungfish that jump from pond to pond in Florida.
I think he's talking about Tiktaalik here. He's about to bring up Tiktaalik. He's about to make the point that we were missing something in the fossil record. Scientists made a prediction about where that thing would likely be. They looked, and lo and behold, there it was.
Florida and end up in people's swimming pools. And they're amphibians, frogs and toads, croaking and carrying on. And so people wondered if there wasn't a fossil or an organism, an animal that had lived, that had characteristics of both. People over the years had found that in Canada, there was clearly a fossil marsh, a place that used to be a swamp, had dried out. And
this is what I was talking about earlier. It's so fascinating. Swamps, marshes, they're pretty interesting. I really like where the ocean completely dried up and we can like look around and see gigantic bones of like huge sea creatures like whales and stuff. It's so fascinating to me.
They found all kinds of happy swamp fossils there, ferns, so on, and organisms, animals, fish that were recognized. And people realized that if this, with the age of the rocks there, as computed by traditional scientists.
Usually they find rocks with some kind of radioactive material nearby, I think, for rocks. Radiocarbon dating is only useful for things that were alive at one point and, oh my God, what's the word? Where they're breathing. Alive and breathing at one point, where they're taking in air. There's a specific word for this, a scientific word I cannot remember.
With the age of the rocks there, this would be a reasonable place to look for an animal, a fossil of an animal that lived there. And indeed, scientists found it. Tiktaalik, this fish lizard guy. And they found several specimens. It wasn't one individual. In other words, they made a prediction that this animal would be found, and it was found. So far, Mr. Hamm and his worldview, the Ken Ham creation model, does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions. And
maybe the capability to make predictions is what makes any scientific model useful, valuable, and trustworthy. There's the theory of evolution, and there's the fact of evolution. The theory of evolution is an all-encompassing, overarching understanding of how all of these pieces fit together. The fact of evolution relates to the fact that creatures change over time. Evolution as a theory helps us make predictions about things. Ken Ham's ridiculous creationist bullshit doesn't help us predict anything at all. Is worthless.
And show results.
Rubidium-strontium dating is another way they use for geologic dating. Okay, interesting.
Here's an extraordinary one that I find remarkable. There are certain fish, the top minnows, that have the remarkable ability to have sex with other fish, traditional fish sex, and they can have
sounds hot.
Sex with themselves. Now, one of the old questions in life science, everybody, one of the old sort of chin strokers, is why does any organism, whether you're an ash tree, a sea jelly, a squid, a marmot, why does anybody have sex? I mean, there are more bacteria in your tummy right now than there are humans on Earth. And bacteria, they don't bother with that, man. They just like split themselves in half. They get new bacteria. Like, let's get her done. Let's go. But why does think of all the trouble a rose bush goes to make a flower, and the thorns and the bees swimming, flying around, interacting. Why does anybody bother with all that? And the answer seems to be your enemy.
Disease.
And your enemies are not lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, no. Your enemies are germs and parasites. That's what's going to get you. Germs and parasites.
Yeah, I mean, for example, there were more deaths from the Spanish flu in the World War I era than there were to World War I believe.
My first cousin's son died tragically from essentially the flu. This is not some story I heard about. It's my first cousin once removed. Because
once removed relates to the generation. If you guys weren't aware of this, the number of times removed is the generation they're from, and the cousin number is how far out they are, right? So if I have a kid and my uncle has a kid, my uncle's kid is my cousin. My uncle's kid is my kid's cousin once removed. Kind of confusing. So it sounds like he says it's his first cousin once removed. So it was his uncle's, it was his dad's cousin, is what that means. If it's his cousin once removed, it was his mom or his dad's first cousin. I grew up for a while anyways, around my first cousins. So my kid, if she knew my first cousins, would have the same relation to them as Bill Nye is describing here.
Apparently, the virus had the right genes to attack his genes. So when you have sex, you have a new set of genes. You have a new mixture. So people studied these top men.
People in the audience covering their ears because of these dirty words being spoken, I bet.
And they found that the ones who reproduced sexually had fewer parasites than the ones that reproduced on their own. This black spot disease.
Okay, why is there a picture of, I don't know, what is this? Is this like Alice in Wonderland or something? Why is this down here? What does this have to do with anything? I am kind of lost here. There's some girl standing around talking to what appears to be a chess piece.
Wait, there's more. In these populations, with flooding and so on, with river ponds get isolated, then they dry up, then the river flows again. In between, some of the fish will have sex with other fish sometimes, and they'll have sex on their own, what's called asexually. And those fish, the ones that are in between, sometimes this, sometimes that, they have an intermediate number of infections. In other words, the explanation provided by evolution made a prediction. And the prediction's extraordinary and subtle, but there it is. How else would you explain it? And to Mr. Hamm and his followers, I say this is something that we in science want. We want the ability to predict. And your assertion that there's some difference between the natural laws that I use to observe the world today and the natural laws that existed 4,000 years ago is extraordinary and unsettling.
Well, that's the whole argument, really. That's Ken Hamm's entire argument. You don't know what was going on, 1,000 years ago, so you have no way to know if blah, 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 whatever. The natural laws may not have applied, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or whatever. It may be completely different than it used to be, which is absolutely absurd. There is simply no reason to believe any of that. I mean, it's logical and reasonable to understand that the laws that exist in the world right now existed 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, especially when we have very strong evidence that they do. But Ken Hamm is going to make absolutely insane claims that, these laws have changed over time, or you don't know if they've changed or not. Actually, we do know that they have not changed over time. Logic doesn't matter. Dude doesn't care. It's completely irrelevant.
Travel around. I have a great many family members in Danville, Virginia, one of the U.S.'s most livable cities. It's lovely. And
Danville, Virginia. Okay.
I was driving along, and there was a sign in front of a church, Big Bang Theory, you got to be kidding me, God. Now, everybody, why would someone at the church, a pastor, for example, put that sign up unless he or she didn't believe that the Big Bang was a real thing?
Didn't accept that it's a real thing. The Big Bang is a direct truth claim. Either it's true or it is not. They don't accept that it's real. You believe in God because it's something that requires faith to accept. You believe it or you don't believe it. The Big Bang is something you accept or you reject, and so is evolution.
I just want to review briefly with everybody why we accept, in the outside world, why we accept the Big Bang.
Okay. Bill Nye is about to explain why we accept the Big Bang, and I appreciate that he used the word accept there. I just want to point out evolution is a theory. The Big Bang is a theory. That's true. All that stuff is true. They're theories, right? When the scientific world uses the word theory, it's not being used in the same way as when the Christian world or the general population uses the word theory. They're being used differently. The word theory in the general population, what it really means is hypothesis, just an idea that's put forward that has no real backing or logic or evidence behind it at all yet, right? That's a hypothesis. We have no hard evidence to accept this information yet. But a theory in scientific terms is well established, with hard facts behind it. Hard information that serves as a model that is used to make predictions successfully. That's what a theory is in a scientific sense. That's why the Big Bang Theory is referred to as a theory. It is unequivocally and without question true. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Big Bang Theory is true. And so is evolution. You know, one theory that I feel is mislabeled as a theory, I'll give you this one. One theory I feel is mislabeled is string theory. It's really a string hypothesis, not string theory. There is no proof, and there is no way to get any proof for that. Maybe it is true. It does line up accurately, but there's no way to make a prediction based off of it because things are entirely too small to draw certain conclusions about. Like, the strings are too small to make conclusions about them.
Edwin Hubble was sitting at Mount Wilson, which is up from Pasadena, California. On a clear day, you can look down and see where the Rose Parade goes. It's that close to civilization. But even in the early 1900s, the people who selected this site for astronomy picked an excellent site. The clouds and smog are below you. And Edwin Hubble sat there at this very big telescope night after night studying the heavens. And he found that the stars are moving apart. The stars are moving apart. And he wasn't sure why, but it was clear that the stars are moving farther and farther apart all the time. So people talked about it for a couple decades. And then eventually another astronomer, almost a couple decades, another astronomer, Fred Hoyle, just remarked, well, it was like there was a Big Bang. There was an explosion. This is to say...
It was actually the Big Bang. The name was the name was created as an epithet against the idea. It was made to make fun of the idea that this took place. But, then it was discovered that it really did happen that way, and people just kind of kept the name.
Since everything's moving apart, it's very reasonable that at one time they were all together. And there's a place from whence these things expanded. And it was a remarkable insight. But people went still questioning it for decades. Science and conventional scientists questioning it for decades. These two researchers wanted to listen for radio signals from space, radio astronomy. And this is, while we have visible light for our eyes, there's a whole nother bunch of waves of light.
A whole nother. Love it.
That are much longer. The microwaves in your oven are about that long. The radar at the airport is about that long. Your FM radio signals about like this.
Okay, I'm going to rewind in a second. Hang on. Okay, that's really hard to do if you're not in practice, and I'm not, so I'm glad I got that. I nailed that shot. Anyway, somebody mentions music theory. KJ Dog Love mentioned music theory. Music theory is accurately labeled as a theory because it is a framework that is descriptive and can make predictions. I mean, the predictions that it makes aren't like these crazy, incredible things or whatever, but we didn't always have the understanding of sound and music that we have today. It wasn't always as built out and expanded as it is. Music theory is actually very interesting and incredible in its own way.
While we have visible light for our eyes, there's a whole nother bunch of waves of light that are much longer. The microwaves in your oven are about that long. The radar at the airport is about that long. Your FM radio signals about like this. AM radio signals are a kilometer. They're several soccer fields.
Dude, I can never get that chest. Never. I don't think I have ever gotten that chest before. It always falls off the edge. It's very frustrating. So what he's saying is that certain wavelengths are longer than others. So some of them are like soccer field length. Some of them are like, I think, nanometer length. Very, very, very short. And those wavelengths are responsible for audible music and, microwaves and everything. It's responsible for everything. All sound-related things.
They went out listening, and there was this hiss, this tss, all the time that wouldn't go away. And they thought, oh, doggone it, there's some loose connector. They plugged in the connector. They re-screwed it. They made it tight. They turned it this way. The hiss was still there. They heard it that way. It's still there. They thought it was pigeon droppings that had affected the reception of this horn, it's called. This thing is still there. It's in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. It's a National Historic Site.
Oh, I didn't know that. I have to check that out. Basking Ridge, New Jersey? For some reason, I thought it was in West Virginia. Huh.
And Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson had found this cosmic background sound that was predicted by astronomers. Astronomers running the numbers, doing math, predicted that in the cosmos would be left over this echo, this energy from the Big Bang that would be detectable. And they detected it. We built the Cosmic Observatory for Background Emissions, the COBE spacecraft, and it matched exactly the astronomers' predictions. You got to respect that. It's a one.
Well, again, Ken Ham, he does respect this stuff if it matches up with his beliefs. If it doesn't, he will poke holes in it from now to summer. He will just poke hole after hole after hole. He doesn't care how legitimate or strong or valid the theory or the framework is. Should just start referring to it as the framework. He doesn't care how solid the framework is. He cares if it contradicts him or not, ultimately. He has a starting point, and he works backwards from there. That's not how you do science. That's not how you come to true conclusions about things.
Wonderful thing. Now, along that line is some interest in the age of the Earth. Right now, it's generally agreed that the Big Bang happened 13.7 billion years ago.
It's generally believed that it was 13.7 billion years ago. That could get more specific, and it could go a little bit further out than that, depending on the information that we gather, the things that we learn. It will not go backwards. It will never be in the thousands of years. Never. We've established this beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Do on Earth, these elements that we all know on the periodic table of chemicals, even ones we don't know, were created when stars explode. And I look like nobody, but I attended a lecture by Hans Bethe, who won a Nobel Prize for discovering the process by which stars create all these elements.
He was also one of Carl Sagan's students at Cornell University. Bill Nye was. He was in Carl Sagan's class on something, astronomy maybe? I don't know.
The one that interests me especially is our good friends rubidium and strontium. Rubidium becomes strontium spontaneously. It's an interesting thing to me. A neutron becomes a proton, and it goes up the periodic table.
That is really interesting to me, actually. Protons are made of quarks, and quarks are the fundamental building blocks of everything. There are 6 types of quarks: up, down, top, bottom, strange, and charm. You know, a lot of chemistry and a lot of physics and stuff, a lot of the names that were given to things were given a Latin root All this stuff had Latin roots up until quarks. I don't know what asshole came around and said, you know what? Latin. I don't like Latin. And I also don't like Greek. I don't like any of it. And I'm throwing it all out. And we're going with strange and charm instead. I prefer those. So we're doing that. There's a guy who did that. I don't remember what his name was, but he decided he didn't want to do Latin-based stuff anymore. So anyway, up, down, top, bottom, strange, and charm. Those are the 6 quarks that make up everything in the universe, basically. Up and down are really the ones that make up everything, really, from my understanding. Top and bottom make up some things, and strange and charm make up almost nothing. That's my understanding of it. It's been a while since I've looked into this, but a proton is made up of 2 up quarks and 1 down quark. That's a proton. A neutron is in the center of the nucleus with the proton, and then the electrons circle it. Well, it's more like a beehive. It's not really circling it. It's an inaccurate depiction that we have of it. So a proton is 2 up quarks, 1 down quark. A neutron is 1 up quark, 2 down quarks. Now, quarks are also made up of smaller building blocks. So if a quark loses mass, then it goes from like charm to strange or down to up or whatever. So if it loses something, it becomes something else a little bit, right? So if a neutron loses just the slightest bit of mass in one of its down quarks, it becomes a proton, which has 2 ups, 1 down, instead of 2 downs, 1 up. That's how it works. It's a super interesting area of study, in my opinion. If you want to learn more about like up, down, top, bottom, strange, charm, that type of deal, you can read more about it in the book The Fabric of the Cosmos by Brian Greene, Greene. He's a string theorist, and he knows what he is talking about. It's truly impressive, some of the shit that he, knows and talks about. And he's been on like talk shows and stuff like that a few times. Fascinating. Anyway.
Rubidium becomes strontium spontaneously. It's an interesting thing to me. A neutron becomes a proton.
Right. So that's where a neutron loses a little bit of mass on one of its down quarks. So the down quark becomes the up quark. So now you go from up, down, down, which is neutron, to up, up, down, which is a proton.
And it goes up the periodic table. When lava comes out of the ground, molten lava, and it freezes, turns to rock, when the melt solidifies or crystallizes, it locks the rubidium and strontium in place. And so by careful assay, by being diligent, you can tell when the rock froze. You can tell how old the rubidium and strontium are. And you can get an age for the Earth. When that stuff falls on fossils, you can get a very good idea of how old the fossils are. I encourage you all to go to Nebraska, go to Ashfall State Park, and see.
Yeah, my wife's actually from Nebraska, so I've seen some of this stuff.
The astonishing fossils. It looks like a Hollywood movie. There are rhinoceroses, there are 3-toed horses.
I thought it was rhinoceri, but Bill Nye knows best.
In Nebraska. None of those animals are extant today. And they were buried catastrophically by a volcano in what is now Idaho, is now Yellowstone National Park. It's called the hot spot.
What? I thought he said it was in Nebraska. What's all this? Idaho sucks. We're not talking about Idaho right now.
People call it the super volcano. And it's a remarkable thing. Apparently, as I can tell you, as a Northwesterner around for Mount St. Helens, full disclosure, I'm on the Mount St. Helens board. When it goes off, it gives out a great deal of gas that's toxic and knocks these animals out. Looking for relief, they go to a watering hole, and then when the ash comes, they were all buried. It's an extraordinary place. Now, if in the bad old days you had heart problems, they would right away cut you open. Now we use a drug based on rubidium to look at the inside of your heart without cutting you open. Now, my Kentucky friends, I want you to consider this. Right now, there is no place in the Commonwealth of Kentucky to get a degree in this kind of nuclear medicine, this kind of drugs associated with that. I hope you find that troubling. I hope you're concerned about that. You want scientifically literate students in your Commonwealth for a better tomorrow for everybody. You can't get this here. You have to go out of state. Now, as far as the distance to stars, understand this is very well understood. It's February. We look at a star in February, we measure an angle to it, we wait 6 months, we look at that same star again, and we measure that angle. It's the same.
I talked about this in maybe the previous episode. This is how they calculate distances, and I think they can calculate it up to 300 light years away. That's about as far as you can get. But it's a straightforward way of coming to these conclusions, 300 light years away.
The way carpenters built this building. It's the same way surveyors surveyed the land that we're standing on. And so by measuring the distance to a star, you can figure out how far away it is, that star, and then the stars beyond it and the stars beyond that. There are billions of stars, more than 6.
Yeah, so you measure the angle, and you notice that stars that are within 100 light years are brighter. Stars that are within 1 to 200 light years away are dimmer, and stars that are 2 to 300 light years away are even dimmer than that. And there is an exact correlation to how dim they are and how far away they are.
How far away it is, that star, and then the stars beyond it and stars beyond that. There are billions of stars, more than 6,000 light years from here. A light year is a unit of distance, not a unit of time. There are billions of stars. Mr. Hamm, how could there be billions of stars more distant than 6,000 years if the world's only 6,000 years old? It's an extraordinary claim.
Yeah, it's the amount of distance that light can travel in 1 year. So if you have stars that are 10,000 light years away, it means that light has been traveling from that star to Earth for 10,000 years to finally reach us. And if we get out a telescope and look at what's happening in that telescope, look at what's happening in that star, we're looking back in time. We're looking at light that started traveling 10,000 years ago to finally reach us. We're actually looking back in time. Matter of fact, the sun is 8 light minutes away from us. So if the sun suddenly blinked out, just disappeared on us like that, we wouldn't know it for 8 minutes because we would continue getting its light that entire time. One of the most common things that deaf people say when they finally gain hearing for the very first time is that they thought that the sun made a sound, fascinatingly. If the sun did make a sound, if it was possible to hear the sun's sound, it does make a sound, but we can't hear it because it travels through space and there's no, medium for the sound to travel, blah, blah, blah. But if it did make a sound that we could hear, that was audible to us, that sound would be like a jackhammer going 24/7 all over planet Earth, everywhere. That's what it would sound like. And if the sun disappeared overnight, just in an instant, just disappeared, that sound would continue for about 19 years. We would continue hearing the sound, this jackhammer sound for 19 years after it blinked out. Kind of a little fun fact there for you.
There's another astronomer, Adolf Kittel, who remarked first about the reasonable man. Is it reasonable that we have ice older by a factor of 100 than you claim the Earth is? We have trees that have more tree rings than the Earth is old. That we have
No, it's not reasonable.
Rocks with rubidium and strontium and uranium and
uranium lead, not uranium.
Potassium argon dating that are far, far, far older than you claim the Earth is. Could anybody have built an ark that would sustain better than any ark anybody was able to build on the Earth? So if you're asking me, and I got the impression you were, is Ken Hamm's creation model viable?
The answer is that is absolutely absurd.
I say no, absolutely not. Now, one last thing. You may not know that in the U.S. Constitution, from the Founding Fathers, is the sentence to promote the progress of science and useful arts. Kentucky voters, voters who might be watching online in places like Texas, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Kansas.
Oh boy, this is actually kind of a difficult part to get just right. Let me give it a shot, see if I can hit it. That's one. Got it. Yeah, I think I'm good. Oh shit. Didn't get that one. Got that one. So I missed one so far. Two. Damn it. I'm having trouble gauging how far away that one is. Guess. There we go. All right, I missed two of them. That was pretty good.
Please, you don't want to raise a generation of science students who don't understand how we know our place in the cosmos, our place in space, who don't understand natural law. We need to innovate to keep the...
Do you guys see the cat behind me sitting in the cat tree? He's watching. Somebody says the cat's supervising. Absolutely.
Oklahoma, Kansas. Please, you don't want to raise a generation of science students who don't understand how we know our place in the cosmos, our place in space, who don't understand natural law. We need to innovate to keep the United States where it is in the world. Thank you very much.
Love it. Love everything about it. Bill Nye is an awesome dude. He knows what he's talking about. Very impressive. Some of the things that, I mean, this whole presentation that Bill Nye gave was top tier. It was really, really good. He knocked these arguments out of the park. Like, there is no good answer to any of these conundrums that exist within Ken Hamm's belief system here. There are no good answers to it. Bill Nye basically just pointed out the fact that Ken Hamm is really no different than a flat earther, effectively. Everything that the dude believes is basically as ridiculous as flat earth ideology. That's it. There have been examples of people like tearing down this argument or that argument, pointing out the holes in this piece of logic or that one or whatever for each individual piece. But this debate here is a prime example of Bill Nye just shredding everything nonstop. He shredded every argument. I feel like this is a cohesive, complete breakdown and debunking of every major creationist argument out there. Anyways, yeah, let me know what you think about it in the comments. I think it's fascinating.